Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning for Taxes 101. I believe that this is probably around the 15th or 16th year that we have offered this webinar training. And so we are excited to see some familiar faces that have joined us over the years, and some new names and faces. So thank you so much. We will be recording this session. If you could please make sure that you keep on mute and ask any questions that you might have in the chat throughout the presentation, and we will be monitoring that and being able to address those questions as appropriate throughout the presentation. If there are questions that we don't get to, we will follow up via email afterwards. We'll be sharing some resources in the chat as well, and those resources will be sent out in an email afterwards, along with the evaluation and the recording and the PowerPoint slides. So I want to introduce our team that has been working together to do this webinar, and we're so grateful for our partnerships across the state in order to bring this training to you. There's lots of different taxes can be complicated, right? And so we have lots of different experts in our virtual room today are going to help us learn more about what we need to know to help connect the folks that we work with in the community to those resources and have a successful tax season. And so joining us today is Aisha Savardi from Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid Low-Income Taxpayer Clinic. We have Priscilla Rockwood from Prepare and Prosper, along with Kathleen Murphy, also from Prepare and Prosper, and then Shauna Thompson from Lutheran Social Service of Minnesota. And myself, I'm Mary Jo Katras, and I'm from University of Minnesota Extension, and we are in the Center for Family Development. So just a quick overview of what will happen today. We have again this year what we call our tax primer and resource guide. And so as we're going through the webinar, there'll be lots of different things shared, but there's also lots of wraparound resources that we want to make sure that you're aware of, that you can connect folks that you're working with to. And so to make sure that you're not fiercely writing down things, we put together this guide that will help you navigate those conversations as you have them in the next few months. We will talk about what is free tax prep. Prepare and Prosper will share about their work and the resources and support that they offer. We'll have an IRS update, and then talk about some tax basics. So really talking about some of those things that are just common terminology, common things that we want to make sure that everyone has an understanding of. We'll go over tax deductions, tax credits, and then post-tax return filing considerations, and then some resources. We will make time for questions at the end. In portions of the webinar, we will ask questions within as well. So keep those coming throughout the webinar in the chat. For those that just joined, if you could mute and make sure that you are putting those questions in the chat. And if we need to unmute later on, we can do that as well. So I am going to turn it over to Shauna Thompson, who is going to share a little bit about what I touched upon before, the tax primer and resource guide.
You're muted, Shauna.
Weird, I unmuted and then it muted me right away. So let me find my document again. Here we go. Hi, everybody. I'm Shauna Thompson, and I'm the Financial Counseling Program Director at LSS Financial Counseling. I oversee our statewide team of counselors and work in various other capacities within my role. And I've been involved with Taxes 101 for, I don't know, 10 years, I think. something around that, whether I was attending the training back when I was coaching folks, and I've been helping lead and organize the training for the last several years as well. So happy to be here and see all of you today. And I just wanted to talk to everyone about the guide that will be sent out to everyone who participates in the training. It's gearing up for the 2023 tax season. It's our financial empowerment and resources guide. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but I'm going to go through it high level just so you kind of know what's in the guide and how you can access what's in it. So right at the beginning of the guide will be some contact information for all of the organizations that are represented today on the call. So contact information and some information about what the organizations provide in the community. There'll be some resources for taxpayers. There's a section in the guide that speaks directly to how to have some conversations with your clients at tax time about how to kind of maximize what we call the money moment, right? For some of the folks that we're serving, this is the biggest single check that they'll get throughout the year. And so we like to kind of provide some resources on how to talk to your clients about using that money in the best way for themselves. There's a section on finding free tax prep. So there are all kinds of ways to access free tax preparation in our state, and they're all listed right here in the guide. There's some other tax resources, some legal help for more complicated tax situations. So sometimes things are just beyond what we can help with or what a client might be able to access on their own. And so there's some resources listed in the guide to help with that. And then we've got at the end some common questions. That's a really good section to reference because a lot of times the same kind of questions come up in your when you're meeting with your clients, and that's a good place to kind of get some basic information there. So that's our resource guide, and I'm going to hand it over to Aisha. Or is Aisha going first? Or is Kathleen going?
I think
Nope,
it's me.
It's Priscilla.
Priscilla, I'm handing it over to Priscilla from Prepare and Prosper. So thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you, Shauna, for that introduction and for that information. So hi, everyone. My name is Priscilla Rockwood, and I am the engagement manager for Prepare and Prosper. And I'm here today to talk to you guys a little bit more about free tax preparation, what it is, how people can access it, as well as a little bit on Prepare and Prosper, maybe a brief overview. So, free tax assistance in Minnesota. What is that? There are a couple of different programs, as you can see. So there's the Volunteer Income Tax Assistant, also known as VITA, and the Tax Counseling for the Elderly, or TCE. Now, both of these programs are actually managed by the IRS, but they're operated by IRS partners, and they're staffed by volunteers who are super excited and love taxes and want to get customers their maximum refund. So there's a couple of differences between the two. So for VITA, it is income-based, and it might differ between organizations. There's no age requirement. There's over 200 sites in Minnesota, and it's usually run by nonprofit organizations. So for us at Prepare and Prosper, we're a nonprofit organization, and we are actually the largest VITA site in Minnesota, with 8 different tax sites available throughout the Twin Cities. So we are considered a VITA site, and we are income-based. But as I mentioned before, organizations might differ a little bit. So for us, individuals need to make less than $35,000 to qualify, and then families need to make less than $55,000. Now, for TCE, there's actually no income requirement, but there is an age requirement. So individuals who want to seek TCE need to be 60 years or older to be able to qualify. Usually AARP, and the thing with TCEs as well is that they are really good at answering questions when it comes to pension and retirement for seniors. And we have IRS tax dispute assistance. So if individuals go through audits or are sent to collections, Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid and University of Minnesota Law School are able to assist with that. Now, what is free tax preparation? So free tax prep means that there's volunteers who assist individuals in getting their maximum refund. All tax preparers are IRS certified and they're passionate about taxes and they're passionate about helping the community. All volunteers need to take a test to be able to get IRS certified, and this is only for the tax preparers. Free means free. So sometimes, when you're on the internet, when you're looking at stuff and you search for something free, and then you get asked for your credit card information or any payment info. So technically it's not free, but with free tax prep, it's actually free. There's no hidden fees. There's no hidden anything. It is 100% free for those individuals that qualify. Now there's e-filing available, and we recommend using e-filing because it's safe, it's faster, and people can get their direct deposit quickly. And then every return is reviewed, so you don't have to worry. We are 100% qualified to do this. We are IRS certified, and we are making sure everyone's getting their max refund. So if individuals want to find a free tax prep site, we recommend looking at the Department of Revenue, and you can do this by going online or calling them at their toll-free number. But people can also go to the IRS website, and they can find information there of different VITA sites, different TCE sites as well. Now, if someone doesn't want to go in person to a VITA sites, there's also different resources available to them. So one example is My Free Taxes. So this is a great way for individuals to be able to file online without having to go in person. And there's also IRS, there's a free filing software with the IRS directly, and people can go there. They're both easy, they're both accessible. So it's a great option for those individuals who do not want to go in person. Now, there's also something called getyourrefund.org, and this is a fully virtual VITA service that connects you with someone in the IRS that's a certified tax preparer. Again, great resource for people that do not want to go in person. Now, if someone does not qualify for free tax preparation, if they don't meet those income guidelines, then if they want to go with a paid tax preparer, there's some stuff that we recommend doing beforehand. So first thing is making sure an individual does not qualify, 100% does not qualify for free tax preparation, making sure that they are out and they need to get someone to prepare their taxes for them. Another thing is we want to make sure that they check these people's qualifications. We want to make sure that the people that are preparing the taxes are actually qualified. So they can also read reviews of the preparer. We recommend going to the Better Business Bureau to see if a tax preparer has any bad history or any bad reviews, because that could be a telltale sign that they're not going to be a perfect tax preparer for individuals. Ask about service fees, because a lot of places might have hidden fees as well. So we want to make sure there's nothing going on, nothing that's hidden, and individuals know what they're walking into. Check that the preparer is accessible. So we want to make sure that people are having that accessibility and that support that they need, and making sure that tax preparer can do that. And then review the entire return before signing. Sometimes tax preparers can mess up. People are human, we are all human, and things happen. So we want to recommend always reviewing an entire return before signing it off. Now, a little bit about us at Prepare and Prosper. So again, we are a nonprofit organization. We're volunteer driven. So we have over 300 wonderful volunteers that assist us getting the customers their maximum refund. We do free tax preparation, which is our largest and most popular service. We offer different financial services as well, and financial coaching. We focus on policy change in areas of tax credits, asset building, and customer protection. And we also have a partnership with Sunrise Banks called Fair Banking, a Fair Final Solution. And this way we're able to give the community safe banking options with no hidden fees. So, as I mentioned before, our free tax preparation is our largest and most popular service that we have. All of our volunteers go through over 20 plus hours of training to be IRS certified, and they all love taxes and they love getting people their maximum refund. So what can we actually help with? So at Prepare and Prosper, we can help with the basic tax preparation, so property, state, and federal, but we also help with amended tax returns, previous year returns. So if an individual hasn't submitted their taxes, hasn't filed their taxes for 3 years, 6 years, 2 years, we're still able to help them. We have self-employed returns. So if people make, what was that? Did someone say something? Okay. Well, self-employed returns, if individuals make more than 55,000, but make 6,000 in self-employment, then they can go to our self-employment clinics. We have year-round tax assistance. So hopefully we are all aware that tax time starts around mid-January to tax day. Tax day is typically April 15th, but this year it'll be April 18th. So mark your calendars just in case. That is usually the main chunk of time for tax season. However, at Prepare and Prosper, we also help during the summer and fall. So if individuals aren't able to file their taxes during the main chunk of time, January through April, they're still able to get their taxes filed with us. We have Spanish language interpreters. So this is as requested. I myself speak Spanish, but I'm not necessarily an interpreter. So if someone needs assistance at a tax site, I am more than happy to go and help them out, but we don't necessarily have interpreters on hand at all times. It's just whoever's available in our organization. And we do have a couple people and a couple volunteers that speak Spanish. We do, however, actually have ASL interpreters. So if anyone needs help with ASL, we can provide that. Other things that we can help with, if someone needs an ITIN, and this is the individual tax identification number. So if they don't have a social security number, but they need an ITIN to file their taxes, we can help them apply for one, or we can help them renew one. And then we can also help with audit assistance. So as Shauna mentioned before, tax time is something that we like to call money moment. So this is the time that a lot of individuals and a lot of families get that big single check. And we like to encourage people to try and save a little bit of that money. This is a time that they can boost their savings account. They can look at their credit score. They can work on things financially. They can talk to a financial coach. They can sign up for our FAIR accounts, anything that would help them kind of settle in with that financial wellness. So we want to make sure people are being proactive and they know and understand that this is a great time for them to save a little bit of that money. Although people need, a big chunk of that, it's good to save a little bit. So these are some recommendations that we have. So, boosting your emergency savings with a savings account. If you have children, invest in a kid's future with a U.S. savings bond. There's also College Bound St. Paul, which is very specific to certain age range, but still it's a great option. Requesting a credit report, talking to a financial counselor, which we can provide at Prepare and Prosper, or signing up for FAIR. So if individuals are looking to get a tax prep appointment with us at Prepare and Prosper, individuals need to make less than 35,000, families need to make less than 55,000, and self-employed 55,000, but 6,000 of self-employment. So our appointments right now are only by appointment. Since we are volunteer driven, that means that we kind of hit our capacity pretty quickly. So we have to make sure everyone that's coming into our tax sites they have a tax appointment. So we have 8 locations across the Twin Cities. Appointments are scheduled every 2 weeks on Monday at 10 a.m. So our next scheduling will be February 27th at 10 a.m. if anyone is curious. And people can make these appointments by either calling us directly or they can go online, which I highly recommend because we kind of get bombarded with phone calls and it makes it a little bit difficult. So if people do want to schedule an appointment with us, I highly suggest going online first. Now, for those individuals that do not meet our income requirements, let's say a person makes 38,000 or makes 40,000, they're a little bit over our income guidelines, then our do-it-yourself tax prep program would be perfect. So our do-it-yourself tax prep program is great for individuals that make less than 73,000 and families that make less than 73,000. Sorry, my voice is okay. Sorry. But this is a great option. It's online. They don't have to do it in person. They could do it themselves, but Prepare and Prosper offers so much support. So if someone were interested in our DIY tax prep program, we offer recordings for individuals to get started. We offer a do-it-yourself tax prep guide. And then we also offer live online training. We have webinars, I believe on Mondays, and people are able to ask questions if they're stuck doing their own taxes, if they don't understand something. So it's a great alternative if they're just a little over our income guidelines. So if they're comfortable using a computer, if their taxes are pretty simple, then this would be a great option for them. If you are interested in finding other free tax prep locations, then you can find that in the Revenue State free tax preparation sites. And I think that's it. So if anyone has any questions, now is the time.
There was one question that came through the chat and it was regarding can you file your state tax form for free? So I'll let you answer that because I think we said
Yes.
free is free.
Free is free.
Yeah. Okay. And then one other follow-up question on the DIY. I'm just going to point out, can anyone use the DIY? And there is an income limit with that too.
Wait, what?
The do-it-yourself tax prep. You can make up to $73,000 and use the DIY tax prep.
Yeah. So
With-
if anyone
with us.
makes less than 73,000, then DIY tax prep is perfect.
Yep. Okay. I see 2 more questions that have come in. Can you refer people to do it yourself tax prep if you are employed and have self-employment income? I'll let you answer that.
I'm not sure about that,
Okay.
Kathleen. Do you know?
Okay. Well, if you have self-employment income, if it's less than $6,000, then we can, well, I guess that is a good question. If you do have self-employment income, we could, when you ask questions, we could try and get those questions answered through our self-employment team. So I'm going to say yes, as long as you're, like, say, under the 73,000 limit. But yeah, that might be a question to contact us directly about. Another one with Prepare and Prosper Credit Counselor Service. Is there an opportunity for those outside of the metro area? Do you want to take that one? I'll quickly answer yes. Our Money Mentors program is primarily virtual based, so I believe you can apply to have a mentor because a lot of the meetings are online.
Yeah, they're virtual. Sorry, I was looking at.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm just trying to kind of. I'm just trying to
looking at the chat also. So I
Yeah.
was looking at one that came before.
Okay, so can I use the DIY if I worked out of state? We DIY and actually all of Prepare and Prosper can only do Minnesota state filing. So we can certainly help with the DIY can work for the federal filing, but we won't be able to help with the state that you worked in. So if you work in Wisconsin, we wouldn't be able to help with that filing. Yes, we will send the link to Do It Yourself. It's actually on our website. If you go to our services and you can click down, and I'm not able to keep up with the questions right now.
Yeah, I feel like
The link is also in the guide.
Yeah.
Or
And
Yes.
if,
And the link is to the guide in
Yeah.
the chat as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just added that.
and if you have questions, go ahead, Priscilla, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna answer some of these. So I sent the link. Will you come to our site office to train us? I think that depends on our DIY tax prep team. Right now, we are a little busy because it's tax season, so that might be a little bit difficult. But if you want to reach out to me directly, then we can talk about that a little bit more. Zoila, sí te puedo enviar mi número telefónico, so ahorita te lo mando. Sunrise Banks. So with Sunrise Banks, we have a checking account, savings account, and we also have a credit builder for individuals that either have low credit or are trying to rebuild their credit. So those are the three. And although they're not free, they are low cost. So for the checking and savings account, individuals have to pay $25, but they do have 30 days to pay those $25. And there is no minimum balance. There's no overdraft fees.
Okay, then there's the last question I see is regarding the ASL interpretations. Apologies, we don't have an ASL interpreter on site. Although we could try and work with you to get something arranged. And as Priscilla said at the beginning of the presentation, we do have Spanish speakers that answer our phones, and that I believe all of our customer service agents are fluent in Spanish. So that's not a problem to help make the appointment, and we can try and get somebody on site if requested in advance. And similarly with ASL, we don't have somebody that speaks that on site, but we can certainly do what we can to make arrangements to provide that for an appointment. And I think there's one, and actually we're kind of to time to move on to Aisha's presentation, but I'll try and quickly respond to this last one. Regarding DIY, it states you must make less than 73, but doesn't state that it is for either. So whether it's individual or family, it's a $73,000 limit. And if you go through the process and it turns out you have more than 73, it won't let you file. So it does ask you a lot of questions in the beginning. So if you think you'll be above that, you might want to let us know or double check that, but it won't, the system won't let you file if it's over 73,000. Would like more information regarding self-employment taxes? We do have a self-employment site on our website and can answer those questions if you'd like to contact us through there. And the filing exemptions has changed. That's what Aisha will cover in the next section. And I apologize too, we don't have Hmong translation services with our services. Again, we can do what we can to try and arrange for any kind of interpretation as needed, but we don't have anything immediately on site. Okay, with that, we're going to stop the questions and we'll turn it over to Aisha. Thank you, Priscilla.
Perfect. Thank you, guys. So my name is Aisha Servati, and I'm the director of the Low Income Taxpayer Clinic at Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid, where we assist individuals with representation and advice about IRS disputes. And then we do state of Minnesota if there's also an underlying IRS issue. And we'll kind of get more at the end to some resources that include information about contacting us at the Low Income Taxpayer Clinics. So I'm going to start with an IRS update, kind of on the IRS operations over the last year and going into the 2023 tax filing season for the 2022 tax returns. So the IRS has, beginning of January, improved its telephone support. They did hire over 4,000 new employees and allocated additional resources to answering the taxpayer calls. That has been an increase from during 2022 only about 13% of phone calls were answered and got through to an IRS agent. And so we're looking to improve that by quite a bit, hopefully, with the IRS being able to hire new employees. I noticed myself, I use the practitioner priority service line that I included the phone number here at 866-860-4259. And if you're a practitioner, you can use that line for your clients if you have what's called a 2848 power of attorney or an 8821 form on file with the IRS. And when I've been calling lately, I've been able to get a representative within approximately 30 minutes or so, which is a vast improvement because during 2022, when I would call, I would be on the line for 2, 3, 4 hours and get my call dropped. So I will say there has been improvements. So I will give the IRS credit for that. Taxpayer assistance centers remain open by appointment only. So there are 5 locations, I believe, in Minnesota, 2 in the Twin Cities area and 3 in greater Minnesota. And they are by appointment only. However, the St. Paul Taxpayer Assistance Center on May 13th, 2023 this year from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. will be available for one-on-one consultations for walk-ins. So I've been trying to tell people about that. So if people are in the Twin Cities area or wanting to travel, they can get in a walk-in appointment because the taxpayer assistance centers, it depends on which center you're calling, but wait times are weeks, several weeks in order to get into an appointment. The IRS has decreased its backlog of paper tax returns. And also the last bit of electronic filings that it had. At the beginning of 2022, there were over 10 million returns that still needed to be processed. Right now, they say that they have gotten through, as of February 14th, that they have gotten through all of the 2020, all of the tax returns that were filed by January 2023, before the filing season started for this year. They have gotten through all the individual returns that didn't need to be audited or flagged for additional review. So they are caught up on those. There still do remain about 1.5 million returns that have been flagged for additional review. So they haven't been fully processed and any refunds issued. The issuance of refunds has improved. It's taking about that 3 to 4 weeks that they usually say 9 out of 10 refunds are issued within the 21 days. That is only for those refunds that have not been flagged for additional review. If it has been flagged for additional review, it takes a substantially more longer amount of time. It's often several months to, it has been 6 months or more for those refunds to be issued. And they are still saying that if you're doing things, especially by paper return, and it's being flagged, you can expect that longer time frame. There is still an IRS delay in processing and responding to correspondence. One example I'll give is identity theft affidavits. So when someone has their identity stolen and they're reporting that to the IRS and having their issue resolved, it used to take about 120 days pre-pandemic, but even now today, they're still estimating about 430 days in order to reserve that. And I can say from my own personal experience, it definitely has been over a year that I've been waiting on these client identity theft affidavits. The IRS is, well, it's not necessarily responding to your correspondence. It is issuing notices at an increased frequency. And so a lot of people, you might have clients who are receiving IRS notices. And there was a backlog on sending out notices, but beginning this year, they have opened that up and starting sending out more notices with frequency. One thing I will note is sometimes you'll get an IRS notice close to when it was dated, but you also might get it a few weeks after that and the timeline has already expired or is about to expire. So you want to make sure that your clients pay particular attention to the date on the actual notice, not just the date that they received it, for any deadlines within that notice. And of course, if people have questions about IRS notices that they receive, that is something that us at a low income taxpayer can assist with. So I'm going to talk about some important dates. Filing did begin for accepting electronic returns on January 23rd. January 31st was the IRS sending end of year notices, employers sending W-2s, also certificates of rent paid being submitted. The earned income tax credit and additional child tax credit, if those have been claimed on a tax return and they result in refunds related to those credits, those refunds will not be issued until February 28th and later. The IRS always has a delayed time frame for issuing tax returns with refundable dependent credits. As Priscilla noted, tax day this year is April 18th. So definitely mark your calendars for that. And that's also the due date for the first estimated payments. I also include the estimated payment deadlines for quarters 2, 3, and 4, which is June 15th, September 15th, and January 16th, 2024. And the deadline for doing property tax refunds is August 15th. And then the extended tax return due date, if you filed an extension to file for 2022, is October 16th. So now we're looking at when is someone actually required to file a tax return? And that is based on your filing status, your age, and then it'll give you the minimum amount. If you make this amount or more, then you need to definitely file a tax return. And so for single filing status, for those under 65, it's $12,950. And then for each of these, it's slightly more if you're 65 or older. Married filing jointly is $25,900. Married filing separate is $5 or more. It's always tends to be an amount like that. Head of household is $19,400. And qualifying surviving spouse with dependent child, which also used to be known as qualifying widow or widower, is $25,900. And then self-employed for this year is $400 or more. So who should be filing? So those taxpayers that have income withheld from their pay have some of those refundable credits, like the earned income tax credit and the additional child tax credit portion of the child tax credit. If they qualify for child independent care, American Opportunity Credit. And then I wanted to put in there as well, if they qualified for an economic impact payment or what's on the return as the recovery rebate credit in 2020 or 2021, and they did not file tax returns for 2020 or 2021 and are eligible for those, then they'll want to file a tax return for that, just a simple tax return. And then if they rent or own a home in Minnesota, for that homestead and renter rebates credits. So looking at taxable versus non-taxable income, taxable income is that income that's reported on the 1040, which is like wages and salaries, non-employee compensation, unemployment, cancellation of debt. I also want to mention things like hobby income for people if they're selling things on Etsy and things like that, that can be considered income. A lot of people don't think about that. Non-taxable income, some examples of that are public benefits, child support, alimony, gifts and inheritances. Those tend to be the most popular ones. I will want to note, though, that just because something isn't reported on a tax return does not mean that it doesn't need to be reported for other reasons, such as qualifying for public benefits. So I just want to note that because I've had my own clients, they're like, well, it wasn't taxable income, so why would I report it to anyone? It's like, actually, there are special rules for each program. So you want to make sure if you have low-income clients that they're following those. So I want to talk a little bit about non-employee compensation. They'll receive a 1099 NEC. They are responsible for paying all of the income, Social Security, and Medicare taxes because there aren't any from an employer, and that they are also expected to make quarterly estimated tax payments, which I'll talk a little bit more about as well. I did also want to mention unemployment compensation. That's a 1099-G. It is taxable income, and the full amount in 2022 is taxable, unlike, for example, in 2020. A lot of taxpayers, though, don't have taxes withheld for their unemployment. And so if they don't do that, and they didn't do what I'm going to be talking about as the W-4B in a little bit, they can do things like file that W-4B, they can make estimated tax payments, or they can increase their holding when they do have no employment. And then the last thing I want to talk about when I'm talking about taxable income here is the frontline worker pay. So that was issued last year to pandemic frontline workers. The amount was $487.45. I do want to note that no 1099 is being issued by the state because the amount is less than $600. It's $600 or more that triggers a 1099 being issued. And it's not going to be taxed by the Minnesota Department of Revenue at the state level, but it is at the federal level. So the IRS did recently, just this past week, issue new guidance on some of those state payments that were made in 2022. Minnesota is not included in that list of non-taxable at federal level. So it is taxed at the federal level. So if you do have clients that received it, they have to remember that they received it because they're not going to get a tax form. And then they're going to want to make sure that they include it on their federal return on line 8. But then they won't be having it included on their state tax return. So then they subtract that amount on their state tax return for both when they file their normal return and then if they file for any property taxes. So for filing status, it's important to have the correct filing status because that impacts the deduction amount. It impacts whether or not you have to file a return. Then it impacts the deduction amount for the standard deduction, and then certain credits aren't available if you're doing a certain filing status over another one. And so those filing statuses are single, head of household, married filing jointly, married filing separately, and then that qualifying surviving spouse. And so for married filing jointly, it's if you were married as of December 31st of the tax year. So if you got married on December 30th, you're married for that whole tax year. And then you have to choose if you're doing married filing jointly or if you will do a married filing separately. If you do married filing separately, you both have to, if one itemizes, the other one has to itemize. If one did standard, the other one has to do standard. And then it limits some of those credits and deductions as well. And then the head of household, this is an issue that is audited a lot by the IRS, especially with low income taxpayers. And so for the head of household test, you must be unmarried or considered unmarried as of December 31st. You have to pay more than half the cost of upkeeping a home, and then you have to have a qualifying person live with you for 6 months or more out of the year. I do want to talk a little bit about what considered unmarried means, because we have clients that might be estranged from their spouses, don't live with their spouses, and want to do head of household versus a married filing jointly or married filing separately. So to be considered unmarried, you do have to file a separate return. You have to pay more of those half the cost of upkeeping a home, not live with your spouse during the last 6 months of the tax year, so not just 6 months total. Your home, and this is very specific, has to be the main home for your child, stepchild, or foster child for at least half the tax year. If it is your niece, if it is your grandchild, you are not going to be qualified for considered unmarried. And if you are married and not unmarried, then you would not qualify for head of household. So that is something we run into quite a bit with our clients. And then you have to remember also that a spouse living apart due to a temporary circumstance, you are still considered married for that tax year. And we do have those. An example is spouses who are incarcerated. That is considered a temporary circumstance, not a permanent. And so you are still considered married for the tax year. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about tax withholdings. And so previously, the number of allowances was tied to a number of personal exemptions, but personal exemptions do not exist at the federal level because of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And so now it is based on your filing status, your income, your deductions, and then your eligibility for some of those dependent child and dependent related tax credits. And so the goal was to make the W-4 simpler for the taxpayer. It's kind of debatable whether that really happened. There are now 5 steps to it. It is kind of a condensed form. If you don't have any special circumstances, you can just put in your identifying information and your filing status, sign the form, and be done. If you have a slightly more complex situation where you might have more than one job, or you might be eligible for those dependent credits, or special itemized deductions, or if you just want more withheld from your income, then you'll want to complete steps 2, 3, and 4. And those, everything overall is based on a table, and the IRS kind of changes which amount is withheld based on each filing status every year. And I've heard from other tax practitioners that the amount this year compared to other years was actually less of a baseline withholding. And so you could see clients owing by either a small margin or perhaps a little bit more of a margin if depending on how they filled out a W-4 or didn't fill out this new W-4 that's been around since 2020. So there could be more people owing a little bit of tax than they normally would. And people need to proactively update their withholdings. An employer isn't required to furnish a new one. So they'll want to make sure they're on top of whether or not they need to do a new W-4 based on their circumstances. I'll also talk about a W-4V. I've kind of mentioned that, which is voluntarily electing to withhold tax from your Social Security benefits or your unemployment. So that can be done again by doing a W-4V. A lot of times people don't have taxes withheld, and if their Social Security benefits do become taxable based on the amount that they earn overall and benefits, then half amount of any other income, if that meets the threshold guidelines, then it'll be taxable. They might not have had taxes withheld, resulting in them owing. And then I'll just want to mention as well estimated payments. That's a 1040 ES. And so if taxpayers owe at least $1,000 in taxes after their credits and deductions, and their withholdings and credits are less than the amount due overall, then they are expected to make estimated tax payments using that 1040 ES. And they are due quarterly. I kind of gave those dates in the important dates to remember. And you can make those in small payments throughout the year at the end of the quarter, or sometimes people can make one lump sum due on tax day. There can be penalties though, if you didn't have enough withheld and if you didn't make estimated tax payments, there can always be a penalty for that from the IRS. So I'll talk a little bit about ITINs, the individual taxpayer identification numbers. Priscilla mentioned that because Prepare and Prosper does assist with that, which is something we utilize at the tax clinic by sending people there. So everyone who earns money or lives in the United States is subject to tax and must file tax returns. If they don't have a Social Security number, then they have to apply for an ITIN. Apply for or renewing an ITIN requires an IRS Form W-7. The form itself isn't too complex. I say that as a tax practitioner, but it's not too complex overall. What is more complex is all the identifying documents that you need in order to complete that form. And so you have to provide original documents and mail them into the IRS with your tax return, unless you go to an IRS acceptance agent, a certified acceptance agents, or the taxpayer assistance centers, where they can verify your documentation, sign off that they verified it. Then you don't have to send in your originals, because a lot of times people only have the few documents that they have are the ones that need to be sent in. And then the IRS, as the IRS is, will take several months to process ITIN applications and send people back their identifying documents. And so a lot of times people need to get an ITIN, not just for filing the federal tax return purpose in and of itself, but also for proof of living in the United States, for immigration application processes, financial aid, mortgage applications, other loans. You need your income that's reflected on a tax return. ITINs do expire after 3 years of non-use or on a schedule based on the middle digit. There's 2 middle digits on there. It's usually the third and fourth digits. And those are on a rolling basis. So people need to make sure that they renew them. Something with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act as well is ITINs will not be issued or renewed for dependents or spouses who are not claimed for a tax benefit on the tax return. And so this can be very impactful for those that have spouses or dependents that are not in the United States, but might be in Canada or Mexico, because there are instances when you used to be able to claim those dependents for certain tax credits and benefits that aren't available now. So then if you don't have them for the tax benefit, then you can't have them on your tax return. And so to find a lot more information about ITINs, because there is so much to it, I really recommend looking at IRS publication 1915. So now I'll talk about credits and deductions portion of the presentation. So a deduction reduces the amount of tax that a taxpayer will have for their overall taxable income. A tax credit reduces dollar for dollar the amount of tax a taxpayer owes and can be refundable or non-refundable. So I'll note which ones are refundable or non-refundable as I talk about them. So first, I'm going to talk about tax deductions. And we have the federal standard deduction, which did increase for 2018 to 2025 with that Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So I kind of showing what the standard deduction used to be, what it is now, because we no longer have those personal exemptions on a federal level. So you'll notice the numbers are very similar to those minimum amounts that you needed in order to file a tax return. Those are the standard deduction amounts as well. So for single, it's at $12,950. Married filing jointly or qualified surviving spouse is $25,900. Married filing separately is $12,950, and then head of household is $19,400. I did also want to note the state standard deduction and then the dependent exemption. The state standard deduction is very similar to the federal. You just notice that it's $50 off. For single at $12,900, the married filing jointly or qualified surviving spouse is $25,800. Married filing separate is $12,900, and then that head of household is $19,400, and that dependent exemption is $4,450 per qualifying dependent. So those are if you are using the standard deduction. There are also other deductions that are available, certain ones that you need to itemize, whereas other ones you don't necessarily need to itemize, but they are considered other deductions that are available. But again, that Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, it really impacted what was available for deductions overall. You don't have those personal exemptions, not able to deduct alimony payments. There's no miscellaneous itemized deductions, and you can't deduct moving costs unless you are a military employee. So for available deductions, the first one to talk about a little bit is the student loan interest deduction. So it's deducting up to $2,500 from taxable income. You claim that as an adjustment to your income, so it's not specifically an itemized deduction. So you can still claim it if you're claiming the standard deduction. I will note though that there are probably less people than normal who are going to be qualifying for that student loan interest deduction, because if they didn't pay on their student loans in 2022, for that, the student loan interest deduction won't be available for them. Then I'll note some more kind of moving into some of these itemized deductions that are on a Schedule A. The charitable donations deduction, you can subtract the value of charitable gifts made in the taxable year. In 2021, that was an above a line deduction. So it was available for individuals even if they did the standard deduction. It is now an itemized deduction. And then the limits on the amount of the charitable contributions permitted do return for 2022. So that's based on your adjusted gross income and the amounts that you're making. For example, if you're making a contribution over $250, then there are special circumstances that apply. And then there's the medical expenses deduction. This is something that low and middle income taxpayers may qualify for, especially those that are in assisted living or nursing home situations. It might be more beneficial for them to do itemized and doing a medical expenses deduction, but you can do deduct those expenses that exceed 7.5% of your adjusted gross income for that tax year. And then there's the mortgage interest deduction, which allows homeowners to deduct the amount of mortgage interest paid in that tax year. Something I also want to mention, because I have had cases involving gambling losses and gambling winnings for income. And so you can do gambling losses and expenses deductible only to the extent of your gambling winnings, though. So you can't go in the negative on your tax form itself. Then there's a self-employment expense deduction. This is not on Schedule A itemized, but this is a Schedule C on the 1040. So some examples of those might be home office expenses, business interest, telephone, fax expenses, travel, vehicle use, education, rent, advertising, things like that. So general kind of business expenses that an individual who is self-employed can take on a Schedule C. I did want to mention, because we did have someone email us about something that I thought was very interesting. So this isn't a tax return related deduction, but there are deductions or subtractions from income for public benefits. So an example is the SNAP deductions. They have those for their earnings. There's an automatic $177 and then 20% of your earned income for SNAP on that deduction. There's a deduction for dependent care, child support deduction, certain medical care deductions for those with disabilities or seniors. Then there's the shelter cap deduction, which allows client to reduce the net income by certain shelter costs like monthly mortgage or rent payments, property taxes, utilities, a basic fee for one telephone, things like that are allowed to be deducted so that they then can take their net income and see if they're eligible for that. General assistance, SSI, and MFIP also have deductions and subtractions. The one kind of across the board for all of them is the first $65 of earnings is not counted as income. There are also things for SSI like need-based assistance isn't included, grants, scholarships, and fellowships used for tuition and education expenses aren't, loans you have to repay, things like that. So I just wanted to mention that because a lot of our low-income clients are also going to be receiving public benefits. And so we'll want to make sure that the correct amount of net income is taken in consideration for eligibility purposes, and also the amount that they receive in public benefits. So now I'm going to be moving to talking about tax credits. So there are two different types of tax credits. There's a refundable credit that reduces the amount of tax owed, and any remaining credit is then refunded to the taxpayer. Then there's non-refundable tax credits, which reduce the amount of taxes owed. And so, for example, if someone had, for example, the non-refundable portion of the child tax credit is $2,000 per dependent. So if they were able to utilize that $2,000 to apply against their tax liability, and it reduces, if they applied maybe $1,000 of that and there'd be $1,000 left over, it would not be refunded to them. So now I'll be talking a little bit about claiming those credits. So you claim federal credits on a federal tax return, which is an IRS Form 1040, Minnesota state credits on a Form M1, and then state property tax refunds is an M1PR. So now I want to talk a little bit about claiming dependents. Because the credits I'll be talking about are primarily dependent related credits. And so claiming a dependent has a huge tax benefit. It can do that different filing status, like head of household filing status. It can allow for certain deductions, and then it can allow for certain credits. And the terms for dependents are specifically defined by the IRS. And so there's a qualifying child, and then there's a qualifying relative. I'm going to be talking about qualifying child for most of these because that's what's required for the credits. There are different age requirements associated with each credit and deductions that might be available as well. And so you'll want to make sure with your client that you're following the age requirements or income guidelines for each specific credit, because someone might be a qualifying dependent for one, but not for another one. And then a dependent can only be claimed by one taxpayer in a tax year. There is an exception a little bit for that, for the child tax credit, and then what was the personal exemptions as well. But generally, it can only be claimed by one taxpayer. And I do want to also note that for the requirements in claiming a dependent, the IRS does not have to follow what's in a divorce decree or a parenting time agreement or any other court document like that. They go by their own standards and their own rules to make sure that you meet those requirements. And then you can have a form that I'll talk about in a little bit, an 8332 form that allows you to get around some of the requirements that might go along with what's in a divorce decree itself for a non-custodial parent claiming a child, but not for all of them. And so you'll want to be prepared when claiming a dependent. What you're doing is you are establishing the relationship. So whether or not it's your child, niece, nephew, grandchild, things like that for a relationship test, residency, that they live with you for 6 months or more out of the year, that they don't provide their own support, or if you're doing something like qualifying relative, that you provide over half of their support. And then your priority in claiming the child, because if you're, for example, a grandparent, then there might be a tiebreaker rule where the grandparent has to have a higher adjusted gross income than both of the parents in order to claim that child. That's an issue we see quite a bit in the tax clinic. And that's even if no one else claimed the child, you still have to meet these requirements and include documentation supporting them, even if you're the only one claiming the child, because the IRS might audit you. They have 3 years to audit you once you file a tax return, and they can require these documents, even if you're like, hey, I'm the custodial parent, the kid lives with me full time, what's going on? Why do I have to prove this? It's the way the IRS operates. And you want to make sure that you have documentation like birth certificates, leases, school records, medical bills, that adjusted gross income of the taxpayer, and then any of the parents if it's not a parent claiming. And you want to make sure, this is an issue we see as well, that the documents are dated for the tax year you're claiming the dependent. So if, for example, you're claiming the child in tax year 2022, in order to have, for example, enough school records to establish 6 months or more out of residency, then you'll need records that say on them 2021 to 2022 and 2022 to 2023 school year, to make sure that you cover as much of the tax year as you can. And you want to make sure that you're not just relying on a report card that doesn't have enough identifying information on it, or a report card or letter that is written saying, yeah, the kid goes to the school and this parent is the parent and they reside with them. But if the letter is dated January 2023 and doesn't reference a specific tax year, like during 2022, then that letter, the IRS won't accept it. So you need to make sure that you have proper documentation. And then improperly claiming a dependent can result in the loss of certain credits in the future, having to repay a refund, having a frozen refund, and paying additional taxes and other penalties. And if you have been audited, even if you provide documentation, the IRS is like, yeah, I'm sorry, our bad, you really do qualify, you need to file an IRS form 8862 in order to claim the credit again in the future. So a lot of people don't file that form. The IRS might not catch it in certain circumstances, but might catch it in other circumstances. So you want to make sure that your client files that form as well. So for the qualifying dependent test, you have to meet age or disability requirements, which I'll talk about with each of the credits I mentioned. There are income requirements, whether or not you have a certain amount of income overall. There's a maximum of income that you can have. There's also requirements that you have earned income that I'll talk about. You have to meet that relationship test. You have to have the child living with you for 6 months or more out of the year. Or like I kind of mentioned, you can do the IRS form 8332 for the child tax credit. That form cannot be used for the earned income tax credit. You must have the child live with you for 6 months or more out of the year for the earned income tax credit. So a lot of times people will rely on that form, or again, rely on a divorce decree for all the dependent credits and filing statuses, but you can't necessarily do that. The child has to have a valid social security number. The parent in some circumstances can have an ITIN if they don't have a social security number. They have to be born during the tax year and be on the tax return. And then they must provide more, they must not provide more than half of their own support. So the first credit I'll talk about is the earned income tax credit, which is a refundable tax credit, and you must have earned income. And so earned income is wages, net earnings from self-employment, those sorts of income sources. And then things that are not earned income is like unemployment compensation, social security benefits, other government benefits, child support, alimony, things like that are not considered earned income. So if you have those, but not any earned income, in this case, it just needs to be $1 or more of earned income with the earned income tax credit. So they just have to have some wages or salary or some self-employment in order to qualify. The taxpayer must have a social security number, and the qualifying children must have a social security number. And if a taxpayer has a social security number, but the child doesn't, there is a new rule that allows the taxpayer to claim the earned income tax credit without a child, because you can claim the earned income tax credit and not have a dependent. You must be a United States citizen or resident alien for the entire year, and then you cannot be anyone else's qualifying child. So I want to compare 2021 to 2022 because 2021 was a very special year with legislation that was passed, and a lot of that sunsetted and was only for that tax year. So in 2021, you could use your adjusted gross income for 2020 or from 2021 to determine your eligibility. There is no age minimum or maximum with claiming without a dependent. There was an increased adjusted gross income for those claiming without children. There was an increased credit amount by quite a bit, almost 3 times the amount now existing for those without children. And then you could have married filing separate eligible if certain requirements are met. Now for 2022, the tax year we are filing that return for this year, you must use 2022 adjusted gross income. Someone must be at least 25 years old and younger than 65 if claiming without a dependent for the federal earned income tax credit. The adjusted gross income and the amount of credit for those without children reverted back, which I'll mention on the next slides. And married filing separate is still eligible if certain requirements are met. So that did transfer over from 2021. So I want to talk about that married filing separate exception. And it's for those who are married, but they're separated spouse that they don't want to file a joint return with, and they still want to qualify for the earned income tax credit. So they must live with their qualifying child for more than 6 months out of the year. So you kind of think this is kind of similar almost to that head of household test. And then they do not have the same principal place of abode as the other spouse for at least the last 6 months out of the year, or are legally separated according to a written separation agreement and did not live with the spouse in the same household at the end of the tax year. So looking at this table for earned income tax credit, so the amount of the earned income tax credit that you receive, whether you're eligible and the amount you receive, is based on the number of qualifying children you have, your filing status, and then your income amount. And so if you have no children, your income must be less than $16,480 for all filing statuses other than married filing jointly. Married filing jointly is $22,610, and the range of your earned income tax credit will be $2 to up to $560. So quite a difference from 2021. And then the amount substantially increases if you have a child. Even one child, your income must be less than $43,492 for any filing status other than married filing jointly. For married filing jointly, it's $49,622, and you can get an earned income tax credit up to $3,733. So that amount increasingly goes up depending on the number of children. It maxes out at 3 or more children at $53,492 $57 for all filing statuses other than married filing jointly, and $59,187 for married filing jointly. And the maximum amount of an earned income tax credit you can get for 2022 is $6,935. So I do want to mention the working family credit because that is available at the state level. And it's also a refundable credit. And so generally, if someone qualifies for the earned income tax credit, then they'll qualify for the working family credit. And there is one difference. Individuals without dependents must be at least 19 years old and younger than 65, instead of the at least must be 25-year-olds that is required by the federal earned income tax credit. And so for the state, it's very similar. It depends on the number of qualifying children you have, and then your filing status. And so those kind of numbers are in the table there. I could not find the maximum amount of credit available for each one. I didn't see the Minnesota Department of Revenue having that posted this year, but they usually have an average number of a refund by a family of $534 was last year's. So it's a number similar to that. So it's a lot less than on the federal level, the maximum amount of what you'll receive, but it is still an additional refundable credit. Next, I'll move on to the child tax credit. And so the child tax credit is designed to give that income boost to parents or guardians of children or dependents. For the child tax credit, I'll talk about this in a little bit, but a portion of it is non-refundable and then another portion of it is refundable. So the child must have a social security number, but the taxpayer can have a social security number or ITIN. And then if a taxpayer with a non-child dependent, they may qualify for the other dependents credit, which is a $500 non-refundable credit. So if they don't meet the qualifying child test for the child tax credit, they may be able to claim that dependent for another tax credit that would be non-refundable. So again, like we did with the earned income tax credit, I want to compare 2021 and 2022. As you might remember, there was a lot of legislation around the child tax credit for 2021, and almost everything has reverted back for 2022. So for 2021, the full amount of the credit was fully refundable. The dependent age limit was increased to 17 years old from 16 years old. And then because the amount was fully refundable, there's also a maximum amount of $3,600 for children under 6, and then $3,000 for children 6 through 17. And there were advance payments that were made, or people should have received, from July 2021 through December of 2021 of up to half of their eligible child tax credit. And then there's also no earned income requirement. So we saw a lot of individuals who qualify for the child tax credit who wouldn't have been able to in previous years because of that earned income requirement. Now for 2022, the tax year that we are filing for, it goes back to that $2,000 non-refundable credit with $1,400 refundable additional child tax credit. That dependent age limit went back to 16 years old as a maximum. There were no advance payments issued, and then you must have at least $2,500 in earned income in 2022. Another credit that I'll mention is the Child Independent Care Credit. It's both a federal and a Minnesota state credit. It's for those who are paying someone to take care of their dependent while working or looking for work. So that is a requirement for that. If it's a qualifying child, they must be under 13, so 12 and younger, or it can be a disabled spouse or disabled dependent that lived with the taxpayer for more than half of that tax year. So the specific requirements are that you must have earned income in 2022. You must have paid someone to care for your dependent. The dependent lived with you for more than half of the year. The dependent can have a social security number or an ITIN. And then for the Minnesota state tax credit, there must be an income less than $67,330 for one dependent, or $79,300 for 2 or more dependents. So there is a maximum on income for that impacts the amount that you receive. So for the child independent care credit, you can claim a credit for up to 35% of qualified care expenses. So the maximum amount for one dependent is $3,000. For two or more, it's $6,000. So as a result, your maximum credit is $1,050 for one dependent and $2,100 for two or more. And so it's for qualified expenses, and those expenses can include center-based childcare, babysitter care, summer camps, or care provided an adult relative outside the tax household. I do want to talk a little bit about that caregiver. So the caregiver cannot be a parent of the child or cannot be a spouse of the dependent, cannot be anyone listed on the tax return as a dependent, and then can also not be provided by your own child who's 18 or younger, regardless of whether or not you actually claim them on your tax return. And so expenses that are incidental to care, meals and snacks paid separately, camp supplies, those sorts of things would not qualify as qualified expenses. You must have the care provider's name, address, and taxpayer identification number, and documentation of your paid expenses. That can be a difficulty for some of our clients because they might have their neighbor provide care, but if they claim the child independent care credit for certain expenses they paid to that neighbor, they would need their neighbor's identification number. And then based on the amount of that income that was provided, the IRS will expect that neighbor to have claimed that as income. And so a lot of people don't want to put their neighbor in that situation. And so they are then ineligible for the child independent care credit. So they do have to make sure that they get all that information because that is required on their tax return. And then if the individual is married, they must file married filing jointly. So I just want to again compare 2021 to 2022. In 2021, it was a fully refundable credit on both the federal and state levels. You could actually claim up to $8,000 of qualified expenses for one child or $16,000 for two or more. And that made the maximum credit $4,000 for one child or $8,000 for two or more because you got 50% of that back. In 2022, it is non-refundable. Again, you can claim up to $3,000 for one child, $6,000 of qualified expenses for two or more, but that maximum amount is 35% instead of 50%. So it is $1,050 for one child and $2,100 for two or more.
Aisha,
Yeah.
can you explain again explain the refundable versus non-refundable credit? Someone was asking that.
Yeah, definitely. So for the refundable credit, if, for example, the credit is $3,000 and then you have a tax liability of $2,000, so there's $1,000 left over, let's say. If it's refundable, you get that $1,000 as part of your refund. If it is non-refundable, you don't get it back. And so it just zeroes out. And you miss out on that $1,000, if that kind of makes sense between what's refundable and non-refundable. So there are two education credits, and there are slight differences between the two, which is why the IRS kind of offers both as an option. So there's the American Opportunity Credit, and that helps make post-secondary education more affordable for the taxpayer's spouse, or any dependents. The maximum credit is $2,500 per student, up to $1,000 of which is refundable. And so what that equals out to is that you apply the credit and then 40% of any remaining amount of the credit can be refundable. So that's how it's up to $1,000. There is an adjusted gross income requirement of $80,000 or less, with nothing available above $90,000. Qualifying expenses include tuition, enrollment fees, required course materials. You'll get a 1098-T from the educational institution. And then there are very specific requirements in order to be eligible. So you have to actually pursuing a degree or recognized educational credential, enrolled at least half time for one academic period, have not completed 4 years of post-secondary education at the beginning of the tax year, not be convicted of a felony drug offense, have not claimed the credit 4 times, and you can have a social security number or an ITIN. Then there's the lifelong learning credit. This one is non-refundable across the board. The maximum amount is $2,000 with similar adjusted gross income requirements. And you may claim if the taxpayer's spouse or dependent attended a post-secondary education, but are not eligible for the American Opportunity Credit. So unlike the American Opportunity Credit, they don't need to be pursuing a degree or credential. Instead, they could be doing job improvement skills. And then the federal drug conviction rule does not apply. And there's also no limit on the number of years the credit may be claimed because, again, it's a non-refundable credit. So qualifying expenses include tuition and fees required for enrollment, educational materials purchased from the post-secondary institution specifically. So not the book that you got from Amazon, but the book that you got from the college store. Then the last two credits I'll be talking about are state property tax related credits. The first one is the homestead credit refund. And so that is a refundable Minnesota state property tax credit, which is based on the income and the amount of property taxes that we will pay in 2023. And there are certain requirements. You must be a full or part-time resident of Minnesota during the tax year, so 2022, own and live in the home as of January 2nd, 2023, classify the home as your homestead, have a valid social security number. So having an ITIN isn't sufficient. Have a household income below $128,280, not be a dependent of another taxpayer, and have paid all your property taxes or made arrangements to do so. So the maximum refund available for that is $3,140. Generally, people will apply for it by August 15th of that tax year, so of 2023. You have up to a year to file a previous one. So for example, for this one, you would have until August 15th, 2024 to file for that credit. Then there's the renter's property refund, which again is a refundable state property tax credit based on your income and the amount of rent paid in 2022. There are also similar requirements with some differences. You must live in the building where property taxes were assessed and paid, be a part-time or full-year Minnesota resident, have paid rent in Minnesota. You can have a social security number or an ITIN. You cannot be a dependent of another taxpayer. Have your household income be below $69,520, and then have a certificate of rent paid issued from your landlord. And that certificate of rent paid should have been issued by January 31st of this year. If you did not receive it, then you need, if the client didn't receive it, then they need to ask their landlord for one. If the landlord also made a mistake on the form, or if there's some kind of issue with the form, then you need to ask the landlord to issue a new form so that they can file it with their tax return. If they do not receive a certificate of rent paid, or their landlord does not correct an incorrect certificate of rent paid, then beginning after March 1st, they can file with a certificate of rent paid affidavit, which just includes their information, where they rented, the amount of rent that they paid, and they're asserting that all the information they're providing is correct, and therefore they should be allowed to claim the renter's property refund. So the maximum refund amount is $2,440. And again, it has that similar deadline. So normally most people will be filing by August 15th of 2023, and they have until August 15th, 2024 to file for it if they're filing for that year later. I will note that a lot of the property tax refunds are issued within 30 days of August 15th. And then some of them, if you're doing it, if you've already filed, you can already file the return, and then electronically the funds might become available before August 15th. So some post-return filing considerations, and these are things that we deal quite a bit at the low-income taxpayer clinics with, is does the client owe any federal or state agencies? And it doesn't just have to be for tax. It could be, for example, past due child support. And they'll want to watch out for refund offsets and revenue recapture, which I'll be talking about on the next slide as well. And then does the client have sufficient documents to support their filing status, credits, or deductions in the event that they were audited? And so, like I mentioned before, the IRS can go back 3 years. So you want to keep your documents for at least 3 years, because it's a lot harder to try to recreate the documents or find documents from 3 years ago right now than if you had them all put together. If you have to go back and try to go to schools, go to doctors, see if the records still even exist, look at what your lease was, different things like that. If you already have the documentation, then you can reply quickly and efficiently to the IRS, because the IRS does have deadlines. And so a lot of times people will be scrambling to look for documents. They'll send in whatever they can find. The IRS will say it's not sufficient, and then they'll continue trying to assess and audit the individual. And then did the client just become aware that they're eligible for a credit or a deduction? And so if that's the case, they'll want to file an original or amended return within the past 3 years. You have up to 3 years to claim a refund from a tax return. And then I did want to mention again, those economic impact payments, the recovery rebate credits for 2020 and 2021. If they didn't claim them and they just realized, oh, I was actually eligible for that, the only way to get those payments is on a tax return. So they need to file a 2020 or 2021 tax return in order to claim them. Economic impact payments 1 and 2 were on a 2020 return. Economic impact payment number 3 was on a 2021.
Hey,
And then,
it's Shauna. Can you clarify, because someone in the chat was asking about prior year renter refunds?
Yep.
You can just go back 1 year for the refund on the renter refund, correct?
Yes, it's just 1 year. So it'd be 3 years for on a 1040 or similar tax return.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
And then, did the client recently move? So if they recently moved, they'll want to update their address with the IRS in order to get their mail, in order to get their refund, things like that. So you can update it on your next tax return. You can call the IRS, which will hopefully get you a little bit quicker than previously. Or you can write the information to the IRS, and you can fill out a form 8822. A lot of times I recommend that people fill out a form 8822. It takes about 45 days allegedly for them to process the form and get it put back into their system with your new information. And then otherwise, if you are close to, like right now, tax filing season, you can just put your new information on the tax return. And so a lot of times people will be like, hey, where's my refund? I haven't received it. It's been over 21 days. What's going on? There might be a reason that it's delayed, or that they get a notice from the IRS or Minnesota Department of Revenue. And that's if they have unfiled or miscellaneous tax returns for prior tax years. For example, the IRS can file what's known as a substitute for return, and they can go back as many years as they want to go back. If you didn't file a return but should have, they can always go back, file that return, and then assess you any taxes that you have due. If they did a request for a paper check, it might have been held a return due to a problem with the name or address, because perhaps there was a change. If you can imagine, someone filed a return in 2022, but it took a year or more, for it to be processed. Their address could have changed. They could have requested a paper check and then they didn't get their refund, or their bank account could have even changed and they didn't get their direct deposit. So there's a lot of issues that can happen with that. A person can elect to have your refund go towards an estimated tax liability for the next year. And then the IRS or Minnesota Department of Revenue might be actually reviewing their tax returns. So they might say, hey, we think there's an error here. We're going to now examine the tax return. And like I noted at the beginning with the IRS update, the IRS has millions of returns that they have gone through and initially processed it, flagged it for an error or something to additionally review, and then it's just sitting there waiting to be reviewed. And then something I want to note, because I did mention on the last slide too, is that idea that the refund can be applied to a debt that you owed to the IRS or another federal or state agency. And that's known as a refund offset or revenue recapture. There is something a taxpayer can do specifically for an IRS federal tax liability debt. is you can apply for an offset bypass refund, or OBR, with the IRS, but again, it has to be a federal tax stat refund offset. It can't be for a state tax liability. It can't be for a liability with another federal agency or state agency. And you apply for that with the Taxpayer Advocate Service, which is an independent part of the IRS, who specifically is there to uphold taxpayer rights and assist taxpayers. And you contact them by completing an IRS Form 911. And then you file that, make the request and file it concurrently with the time you're filing the tax return. So it's really hard to go back and request an offset bypass refund if the refund has already been captured and applied to the previous tax set. So looking at legal help, there is assistance for low to middle income taxpayers with those audits, back tax payments, other related issues, and there are 2 low-income taxpayer clinics. Us at Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid, you can contact our intake at 612-334-5970. The University of Minnesota also has a tax clinic that's available. There's an attorney that oversees the program, and then student volunteers that are working for a class. Their line is 612-625-5515. And then the Volunteer Lawyers Network is also available. They will do, so the low-income taxpayer clinics have the focus on federal tax debts. Like I mentioned at the beginning, we can only do state if there's also a federal issue. Volunteer Lawyers Network can do certain state-only issues. So their line is 612-752-6677. With all 3 of the organizations, unlike Prepare and Prosper, we do not assist with tax preparation or filing. So we refer clients to those VITA and TCE sites. A lot of our Twin Cities clients will refer to Prepare and Prosper and things like that. And then lastly, I just want to mention some of the resources that you'll also see in the resource guide. So on the federal level, there's the Taxpayer Advocate Service and those taxpayer assistance centers. So that's how you can find out more of their information or call them specifically. On the state level, like the Taxpayer Advocate Service, there's an office called the Taxpayer Rights Advocate Office, which is an independent part of the Minnesota Department of Revenue that can help make sure there's a fair and equitable process that's being filed at the Minnesota Department of Revenue level. For those tax preparation and VITA and TCE sites, I really recommend that Department of Revenue search for free tax preparation sites, or calling them if your client isn't able to utilize the internet for that. I will note that the Minnesota Department of Revenue updates that list throughout tax filing season, and then even slightly afterwards as well, because as Prepare and Prosper kind of noted, they're available not just during filing season, but also during the summer and fall. A lot of VITA and TCE sites are not. They're only available for tax filing season. And so on that Minnesota Department of Revenue website, they will list how long a site is available and open for, and they update that as sites update their information as well. And then just some general information, the United Way 211 is a great resource. And then Law Help MN has fact sheets for a plethora of civil legal issues, but there are also tax fact sheets that I helped develop as well. And so if someone's just looking for, hey, what are some tax credits for low income individuals? There's a sheet on that. There's a sheet on the renter's rebate credit. There's a lot of resources available if people are looking for more information. And then if you have any questions, any client referrals, if you would like an education event for your organization about any tax issue, I'm available. Again, Aisha Servati at Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid, and my email's here at aservati@mylegalaid.org, or you can call my phone number 612-746-3636. And again, our intake line is where you would refer a client specifically if they have a tax issue, or if they have received an IRS notice, different things like that. That's 612-334-5970. So I'll take any additional questions people have.
I think Kathleen had put one in the
Yeah.
chat asking if there was any income limit to get legal help.
Yes, so at the low income taxpayer clinics, if you want representation, it's 250% or less of the federal poverty guidelines. If an individual though just wants a question answered, or if we can just offer some advice, that's available to everyone regardless of income. And I should also note that the low income taxpayer clinics are for the entire state of Minnesota. We're not just Twin Cities metro based.
So we're able to answer lots of questions in the chat while you were presenting. Thank you so much, Asia, for all your wonderful presentation. But if anyone has more questions or questions you've thought of that you want to ask, and you can unmute or you can put them in the chat, and this is your time.
Yeah, I just wanna, my name is Blanche Nicole. I just wanna ask a quick question about the rental tax certificate of rental pay.
Yeah.
So if I had to claim for 2021 and 2022, can I put it all in the same form, or do I have to go back for 2021 to claim that?
So each year would be on its individual form for that specific year. And the deadline for if it was being claimed for 2021, that you'd want to make sure that you would get that in by August 15th, and you would go on to a 2021 M1 PR. And then you do 2022s on a 2022 M1 PR. And then you just want to make sure that you do it individually, but you can get them prepared at the same time.
And again, to clarify, the 2021 deadline is August 15th this year. But the 2022, if you want your refund as soon as possible, it should be filed this year by August 15th, but you could still file it until August 15th of 2024.
One issue that I see often is that with the homestead credit, income that will not be taxable or considered income, it's on the homestead, right, for the application? Like they ask you about that, and also they take in consideration like household income, right?
Yes, it's the entire household.
And a lot of people don't know that, so I see that later on they get audit and then they have to pay this money back.
Yeah, that's a really good point, is making sure that it's whoever's makes up your whole household, that you get all of their income and information, and not just the individual who might be the homeowner.
So we have two folks that raised their hand. Thank you. I know I'm not going to pronounce your name correctly. Tanea, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you, Mary Jo. It's Tainea. I have a question. Can you please repeat what you mentioned about of the form or forms or the reference regarding if you know you owe the government? There was a particular form or something you said you can use to set up payment arrangements. You mentioned quite a few things around that, and I only caught the tail end of it.
I'm trying to think of exactly what I mentioned.
You were just mentioning about different like ways that you can connect with the IRS if you owe rather than receiving taxes, you owe taxes, and you were talking about how you can split it up in payments, but then you also mentioned something else around a form or something you can file or fill
Like
out.
with the offset bypass refund.
That doesn't sound like what I remember you saying,
88?
but
Was
you
it
may have,
88?
maybe, but it was just a slide where she was talking about some different tips, tools and things that you can be mindful of when you are needing to make payment arrangements, if you owe a certain amount.
There's the 1040 ES where you can do estimated payments. And I can just say too that if someone owes the IRS, they can make, I'll give you more form numbers, but an individual can request an installment agreement where they pay an amount up to 72 months. And that I really recommend people call the IRS or they create an IRS account online and do it online. Then an individual can do currently not collectible status where they do temporary collection suspension. And that you would fill out an IRS form 433F and submit that to the IRS and call them and request that. And then you can do an offer and compromise, which is a 656B packet. That is made up of a 433A OIC and a 656. So there are options for that. There is the IRS form 911 for requesting assistance from the Taxpayer Advocate Service. There's like the form 8822 if you need to change your address. And then I know I mentioned an 8332, which is the form if you're trying to claim a child by a non-custodial parent for the child tax credit.
Okay, I think it was the 1040 ES and then the installment. That when I believe you mentioned that as well. So I think that answers the question. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And if anyone has, I will say, if anyone has a specific question, not just about the presentation, but if you have a specific question that maybe come up, you're thinking, oh, I have a client issue like that, feel free to email me and I can offer some advice about that, about a certain specific situation. So always feel free to email me if something comes up afterwards as well.
Maria, you had your hand up.
Thank you. I just have a question. What about the clients who qualify as a head of household because they don't have kids, but they have a mom, for example, or that qualifies them as a head of household because they are in charge of paying for housing and everything? They will stay still qualified, or is any changes on the head of household?
So for head of household, you can have a qualifying dependent. It could be, are you saying like if the taxpayer's parent is with them?
Yes, like in the past, people qualified if, let's say that I am paying for my mom's care back in Mexico. I pay for her food and everything. She can't qualifies me as a head of household because she's my dependent.
Yes.
Is any changes there or stay still the same?
That's a great question. It is still, if it's your parent that's in Canada or Mexico, that can still qualify you as head of household, as long as you meet all the other requirements. That can be a qualifying dependent, but it cannot be a child that is in Canada or Mexico that's not in the United States with you. So that's the difference that they made with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. They still left it for a parent. They would need to have an identification, individual tax identification number, an ITIN, if they don't have another tax identification number. So the parent would need to have an ITIN, the taxpayer would need to have a social security number or ITIN.
Thank you.
So Laura has a question in the chat. Aisha, can you see the chat?
I can't. but
The last chat. It's just a long, I just thought it'd be best for you to read it.
I was actually just reading it and trying to reply with some information. The
Okay.
question is, had several jobs in 2022 that add up to a little more than the 73,000, but I will like to file with the IRS issue notice 2014-7 that states certain wages earned can be excluded from federal income tax. So will this qualify me, or at least could you guide me in the right direction to get them done? So the 73,000 is to use our, at least P&P's DIY tax services, which it is a situation that could qualify. So I was just going to refer our DIY email to ask the question, unless Aisha, you have an answer for that.
no, I would refer to that. And I will say that the 73,000 is the maximum as well for some of the IRS websites free file. And some of them are actually less than 73,000 as well. So you want to make sure that you look for the right program as well.
And I'm just putting our email address to ask that question into the chat. There you go.
There is also a question, let's see. Can you go over a little bit about deductions and whether it helps an individual or hurts their filing, and whether itemized or standard is good for the filer? That seems like a lot, but I'll let you go for it.
Yeah, so a lot of times an individual wants to take advantage of a deduction if they're eligible. It'll just depend, like you mentioned, do they do the standard deduction or do they do itemized? For most of our low income and middle income clients, the standard deduction will be more than if they itemized. And because there are a limited number of itemized deductions remaining with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act through 2025. And so most of our clients will do that standard deduction. Instances like I kind of mentioned where you might do an itemized deduction is if you did have something like gambling winnings and losses. If that was substantial enough, you might want to itemize for that. I know individuals that do that. And the medical and dental care expenses is a large one. If it's, whatever is over 7.5% of your adjusted gross income, which can be a lot for certain individuals, then they'll want to itemize that as well. Or if they make, it's usually not our low and middle income clients that make substantial charitable contributions and things like that. So they usually wouldn't itemize that. But my bottom line advice to people is which number is larger for a deduction? Is it the standard deduction or is it if you itemize? And again, if you're self-employed, that's its own separate Schedule C, not a Schedule A. So you can still take those self-employment expenses as well on your Schedule C.
And Kim has a question. Kim says, we get questions sometimes for federal student loan borrowers who want to try to get a lower income driven repayment by using married filing single. Generally, could you go through what to consider when using that option? We normally refer them to Tax Pros, refer them from Tax Pros to.
Yeah, so for that, I mean, when someone's just deciding in general between married filing separately and married filing jointly, one of the main considerations is, you might not be eligible for certain credits, like I mentioned, like the child independent care credit, you wouldn't be eligible for. You'd have to meet that specific circumstance for the earned income tax credit, like things like that. So the credits and deductions is a part of that. If that's not applicable to you, and if it isn't, if you're doing married filing separate, like I mentioned before, if one person itemizes, the other person has to, which might not be beneficial to them. So you both kind of have to agree to do the standard deduction potentially if that is the overall biggest financial benefit. But with individuals for the married filing separately, as well, I mean, your standard deduction is less than if you did married filing jointly for you as an individual. And then it really depends too, because I know for like some like student loans things, they will, some of them, like they'll ask questions not just about what was on your individual tax return, but they also might ask about your household. So it's not just looking at your individual income on the tax return, but sometimes they'll look at, okay, but if you're still in the household with someone else, then their income will impact that as well. So that's another thing to take in consideration. And then for married, one pro to married filing separately over married filing jointly is that you're not jointly liable for another person's tax debt. So I do recommend married filing separately if the other spouse is going to be owing a tax debt that the one spouse is, hey, that's not my issue, I shouldn't have to owe any of that tax debt, then I would have them file married filing separately over married filing jointly.
Any other questions? We have a few minutes left. Okay, well, we will be sending, like we've shared, we'll be sending out the recording, the PowerPoints, the evaluation, and the resource guide in an email follow-up. And you have contact information for all of us. I want to thank our presenters, Aisha and Priscilla, and Kathleen and Shauna, for, again, this wonderful partnership. This was wonderful. It's really provided our everyone such great resources and opportunity and space to ask questions and connections for those further questions that will continue after this webinar. So please let us know if you have if anything else comes up. And when we send out the evaluation and all of that follow-up email, if you want to share it with others, please do as well. So I'm going to stop the recording, but if you want to, I will stay on if there's any other follow-ups that I can help to make connections to. Otherwise, thanks again for joining us and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone.